I'm afraid there is not the slightest foundation for that claim. But it is quite possible that in the days of the Aesir and the Vanir, the legendary heroes of the Nordic race, that Uppsala was a town connected with their culture. But I cannot see that Uppsala was ever in the slightest degree related to Atlantis. I'm not sorry about that, because it would have made life much more interesting, but that is not the case. In exactly the same way, Pastor Jürgen Spanhuth recently wrote a book in German, which is translated to English, called The Atlantis Mystery Solved, in which he said that Atlantis lay in the North Sea and that one of its capital cities was of Heligoland. But again, this, I'm sorry to say, is impossible. What did happen was there was a culture in the North Sea where the Dogger fishing bank now lies. And somewhere about 6000 BC, this culture was submerged together with a whole lot of towns and villages, and that is the culture of which Pastor Spanhuth is writing. Another similar work is the Linde book, which was discovered, written in Old Frisian. It was discovered in Holland about a century ago. And that postulated a civilization of about the time they thought of Atlantis, living further south in the North Sea. Again, yes, there was a civilization there. Yes, it was contemporary with that of Spanhuth, but it was not part of Atlantis. It was far too far away. Again, I very much regret it, because it was an interesting culture, but it doesn't happen to be the one for which we're looking. Now, as to Atlantis being in North Africa, well, quite a lot of people, including the Gattefossé brothers, who were really experts on the whole question, thought that North Africa had been Atlantis, particularly the region of the Atlas Mountains. I fear that they were wrong, and that most of their ideas were more of a patriotic nature, particularly those inspired by the book by Pierre Benoit called L'Atlantide, which came out in 1919 in Paris, which talked of a queen of Atlantis living in the Sahara Desert in North Africa. I am sorry, but North Africa was not Atlantis. I should much like it to have been it, because it would have saved me a lot of trouble. But this is not the case. It may have been affected by it, it was probably influenced by it, and there may even have been Atlantean colonies along the coast. But it was not Atlantis itself. Now, another idea is that Atlantis lay in the Caucasus. This was put up about 60 years ago by a man called Fessenden, an American engineer who had been resident for many years in the Caucasus. He came to the conclusion that not only Atlantis, but the fount of our civilization sprang from the Caucasus. Well, as far as the fount of our civilization is concerned, there is a lot in it, because most of the artificer clans, like the Cabiri, the Corybantes, the Curites, the Dactyls, the Sintians, the Telchines, and others, started off from the Caucasian coast, most of them from Colchis. But that is not sufficient to give any proof that the Caucasus were Atlantis.
From time to time, stories have filtered down about a possible connection between Spain and Atlantis. We asked Egerton Sykes about that.
A writer in Spain called Verdaguer wrote a manuscript in Catalan between the years 1877 and 1878 called Atlantida, dealing with the relationship between the adventures of Hercules and his people, the Heraclidae, when they occupied Spain, and how they fitted in with his concept of Atlantis. He was the man who inspired Miguel de Falla, the famous opera composer, to compose the opera Atlantida, which was put on at La Scala Milan a few years ago and has since been performed in various Latin American countries, but not, as far as I know, in Northern Europe. The basic assumption was that Hercules and his labors were directly tied up with the story of Atlantis. I cannot quite accept this, because I think that Hercules and the Heraclidae occupied Spain at a date several thousand years after the disappearance of Atlantis. But there is not the slightest doubt that much of the early culture told of in the stories of the Heraclidae, or even written up by the English authoress E.M. Wishaw in her Atlantis in Andalusia, published before the First War, they all show that there was a distinct connection between Spain and Atlantis. I suppose this was because they were contiguous. It was quite easy to get from one place to the other. And I have a very strong feeling that such of the Atlantean culture, which really implanted itself in Europe, may have done so in the south of Spain. In 1973 and 4, there were attempts to find traces of Atlantis off the coast of Spain near Cadiz. Cities and walls were found, but to my mind, while they may easily have been contemporary with Atlantis, or probably slightly later, they were on the European continental shelf, which was separated from Atlantis by a gulf several hundred miles wide and 5 or 6 miles deep. And at no time within the last 100,000 years can Atlantis have been joined to Spain, or for that matter, to the African coast. When we talk about the relationship of Atlantis with Africa, we of course are mainly working on the assumption that refugees from Atlantis eventually reached Egypt and set up the first Egyptian dynasty and brought culture to Egypt. That is quite possible, but the distance from the Atlantic coast to the Nile overland is very long, and it can only have been possible to make it at a time when the climate of the Sahara was different to what it is now. We know that at one period the Sahara supported fleets of elephants, of giraffes, of deer, and all kinds of small animals, and was very, very fertile. Then, for some unknown reason, the climate changed, and it became the desert that it now is. Any migration on a large scale across the Sahara must have been done about the time of the climatic change, certainly not much later. That is something which we shall have to fit in, because as far as we know, the first Egyptians turned up in the Nile Valley about 5000 BC, which is 5,000 years later than the loss of Atlantis.